Namaste. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat. I am your host Kamal Madi Shetty and this is Citti Media. Today we have a very fascinating conversation lined up for you. We're going to do a deep dive into the Indian economy. We're going to talk about the Indic civilization and also discuss some amazing ideas from a very interesting book. And to do this, we have with us Harsh Gupta Madhusudan ji. Harsh ji is a co-author of two fantastic books, A New Idea of India and Derivatives. He is a full-time investor and has in the past worked with some very reputed organizations like Bain and Company, MIT Poverty Action Lab, and elsewhere. He is also a CFA charter holder, and by education, he holds an MBA from INSEAD and is an economics graduate from Dartmouth College. And most importantly, he's one of the most dynamic and young thought leaders in India today, speaking to whom is always a delight and a very enriching experience. Namaste, Harshji. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Thank you, Kamal, so much for having me. I request you to please call me Harsh. Thank you for having
Absolutely.
me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harsh. If I can, pick up from something that I read about you, on your YouTube channel, The Long India, and that is that pessimism requires as much humility as optimism. And my first question to you, Harsh, is on those lines. Now, there are quite a few ideas today that I want to explore with you. But the one I want to begin this conversation is with the India story. Now, the economic present and the future of this world's largest democracy that we live in. Now, you have on multiple occasions articulated your views on this and believe that this century belongs to India. And you have put forward a bold forecast arguing that by 2047, India would emerge as the world's largest economy. Can you tell us why you hold this view and what makes you bullish on, as you call it, Long India?
Kamal, thank you once again. As the joke goes, making predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. So all predictions are basically ways of communicating your hypothesis, your thesis. The exact year or the exact sequence is not so important, but the underlying thought process, which is exactly what you're asking me. And I would like to elucidate that. You're absolutely right. I have a thesis which is definitely not consensus, even though one would say in the last few years, there has been more of India boosterism, as it will in parts of the financial press, in parts of global investing community. But I don't think most people who are investing their money or who are serious academics or serious sell-side analysts or professors or even buy-side analysts are at least publicly saying that, India would be the world's largest economy by the middle of the century or, a few years before that. Of course, 2047 is the 100th year of Indian independence. And, one can say, well, that's just some nationalist masala added in. But, I think the rough timeline is what is important. So before I say why I'm bullish, it's important to understand where we are right now. India is the world's fifth or maybe sixth largest right now because of the pandemic. We were already the fifth largest in terms of market exchange rates economy. The largest is the US. The number two is China. Number three is Japan. Number four is Germany. And then right now, basically UK, France, and India have roughly the same GDP, 3 trillion or slightly more. Very roughly speaking, Germany is 4 trillion. Japan is 5 trillion. China is maybe 16 trillion, and maybe the US is 23, 24 trillion. So that's the lay of the land as we speak in late 2021 in terms of market exchange rates. In terms of cost of adjusted, which is known as purchasing power parity or PPP, India is already the world's third largest economy, for some time. Again, the PPP is even more inexact a science than market exchange rates because you have to find out what adjustment you need to make for the cost of living. And not everybody agrees on the exact numbers. There are both methodological and empirical issues, but broadly, again, in this time, the Chinese economy is the number one. They've already overtaken the US in terms of PPP. Number two is the US. And since we generally speak in terms of dollars, the US economy is the only one whose market exchange and PPP economy is the same size by definition, around 23, 24 trillion. Maybe the Chinese are 28, 29 trillion. I don't remember the latest numbers. And the Indians are, depending on how you count it, 10 trillion or so, right? And then, of course, the Japanese and the Germans, mostly developed economies, their cost adjusted living and their market exchange GDPs are not very different. And then of course, this is overall economy sizes. Per capita is very different. The Chinese are very behind. Indians are even further behind, right? Because we are behind the Chinese economy, and our population is basically North America, South America, and at least Western Europe combined. So there is a long way to go. Now, what has happened, if you look at the lay of the land around till the 1500s or even till the 1600s, actually, most parts of the world, or quote unquote, most civilized parts of the world, where basically the economies were agricultural, feudal, and some commerce on top of it. I mean, small exceptions were, for example, Netherlands, parts of Spain, Portugal, UK, earlier Italian city-states. But mostly, most parts of the world broadly had the same standard of living. So your economy's sizes would be roughly proportional to your population. And but of course, the population itself was a function of how productive your economy was, how much food you could grow, or you could at least trade for by other products. But broadly, there was some parity, right? Which is why historically we say that for most of human history, China and India, if we would see them in a modern collective sense, were the world's largest economies, right? And India, especially if you also count Pakistan and Bangladesh right now, but even without that. And it was, Angus Madison says that India was the world's largest economy till about 1000 AD. The Chinese kind of overtook us there, but really in the 1600s, the Europeans started overtaking us. And academics call it the Great Divergence, 1600s, 1700s. And there are many different reasons, theses. It's one of those big topic discussions in economic history that, why did the West grow rich and why did Asia did not? And, people from Prasannan Parthasarathi to, Angus Madison, I mentioned. There are other peoples like, Robert Allen and many other people who've written about this. Some emphasize culture, some emphasize state capacity, some emphasize luck, some emphasize geography, and often many people emphasize a combination thereof. So roughly till around the 20th century, till around late 20th century, so around till 25 years ago, you could say that the West was still, on average, diverging from the rest of the world. Although very small East Asian economies, and of course, most notably Japan, after World War II had started catching up. And then, of course, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the last two being city-states. But really, it was with the rise of China, which started becoming noticeable in the beginning of this millennium. India, to a lesser extent, parts of Africa with the commodity cycle, parts of Latin America, Southeast Asia, parts of it, that we started seeing what now we call convergence. So, where this great historical trend of, say, 300 odd years or 250 odd years, some people started as late as 1820, some started 1750. The exact number is not so relevant. And they start saying, well, that is now turning around. And so these are huge, clearly century-long, at least generation-long trends. And within those trends also, there are decade cycles up and down. Like, for example, the last decade was roughly a strong dollar cycle. So which is why a lot of emerging economies, including India, did not do so well in dollar terms, not necessarily in local currency terms, compared to the decade before. But broadly, we can say that the convergence has started. It's still conditional. It's not a strong convergence yet. It's a weak convergence. Some parts of the world are doing better. Now, within this broad macro historical context that I've given you, I am focusing on the India case. So the reason why it's important to give that broad context is India is in some ways much better positioned than other emerging economies. And I'll come to the reasons why, but nonetheless, it is part of a historical trend. And there are huge, my personal bias or limited understanding based on whatever I have read over the last decade and a half, is that the biggest reason was why the West grew rich. Many reasons, including imperialism, colonialism, slavery. To be fair, slavery was there almost in all parts of the world earlier as well. But the main reason was state capacity. They built what we now see as, quote unquote, the modern state or the modern nation state. And the definition is not fixed, but it keeps on changing. That construction of a state allowed them to coordinate their economies in a way that they could be more productive. So which goes against, so which is somewhere between an extreme free market libertarian narrative that, just purely Adam Smith, that they became rich because the invisible hand of the market made them rich and there was nothing the government did, or very little things the government did. To be fair, Adam Smith was for quote unquote public improvements, or the other kind of extreme view, which was like a Soviet Marxist view that now to catch up, you need essentially an authoritarian dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Well, actually what happened was just somewhere in the middle. You needed state capacity, you needed domestic free markets, but you needed some kind of trade policy, industrial policy, and you needed infrastructure, you needed good education and financial systems. But for that, you need a state, you need collective action along with individual free markets, right? That golden combination is something which India is only now starting to get. And the reason I would say is because in 1947, we became free. 1950, we formed a republic. 1952, we conducted our first elections. 1977, we basically reaffirmed the fact that we will always remain a democracy. And therefore, some political stability was added. In 74, we had become a half nuclear power. In 98, we became a full nuclear power. In 71, we became dominant in what is now known as South Asia, or what we call the Indian subcontinent. And then, of course, 1991 was a huge part, but in this broader context. And the IT revolution, India's story, unlike East Asia, has been more dominated, or at least more focused on the services exports. And we kind of missed on the manufacturing bus a bit, because we kind of went from one extreme of license Raj to zero trade policy and industrial policy in the late 90s. And what we are doing now is we are saying, if we do some trade policy and some industrial policy, like the PLI scheme right now, because one of our enemy nations, it is, I think, fair to say right now, the Communist Chinese Party ruled state uses economic statecraft in a coercive manner, especially during pandemics and wars. And if you do not have your own industrial capacity, you just can't allow to, like, for example, import steel from wherever it is the cheapest, because it would be very difficult during wartime. So what we are doing is we are allowing foreigners to invest here. We are building infrastructure, but we are saying, nonetheless, make in India, even if you're not Indian, and make for the world, make in India, make for Indians, and you don't need to be an Indian. So that's very different from George Fernandez in the 1970s throwing Coca-Cola or IBM out, right? Or earlier Nehru nationalizing Air India, taking it away from JRD Tata, etc., and the corruption and the overvalued rupee, etc. So we are now finally reaching a stage where there is a lot of momentum in terms of our demographics. So we are not old yet like Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, and parts of Western Europe and America. But we are also not primarily children anymore like we were in the 60s or 70s, right? If you look at a population pyramid curve, it's like this now. So in the bottom, it's kind of becoming straight. It's no longer as wide as it is for sub-Saharan Africa right now. So that population, which is right now in the 0 to 20 group, will become the dominant part of the population in 20 years in the 20 to 40 group. So we have a 3-decade window on the demographic side. We have good state capacity. We have political stability. And if I were to just conclude this answer and keep it at a very high level, it's precisely because we have developed a political culture of ruling this massive subcontinent in a self-autonomous sense, self-rule sense, while not having extreme instability. So even though in local elections people might have different choices, it seems like in national elections there is a national sentiment. And I think the last 2 elections have shown that. And even if somebody else wins in 24 or 29, we don't know what will happen in the future. There seems to be a national sentiment in India, which is no longer just a sum of hodgepodge local sentiments. So I think the sense of an Indian identity, which is no longer just an elite Indian identity, but a middle class and a neo-middle class and a mass Indian identity because of technology, because of most people understanding at least parts of English or Hindi, and people easily traveling from Hyderabad to Bangalore to Delhi to Kolkata, Mumbai, without feeling that they are in a different universe altogether. I think that sense of national cohesion, and there are various manifestations of it. Many people are understandably afraid of too much homogenization. That's also fair. But I think that national identity, which historically just a civilization, not necessarily a modern nation, along with the modern state, along with the infrastructure we're investing, along with that stability, starting from a very low base, part of a global convergence trend is the real reason I see, along with technology, and I can go into that, but that is the key reason for our takeoff in the next 30 years, which is our peak demographic window. So sorry for a slightly long and roundabout answer, but it's important to get the context where to place India's story in the broader global history of economics.
Thank you so much, Harsh. I think it's so fascinating that you have actually laid out a combination of factors, both domestic as well as some global. And I think it's very insightful because it sort of makes you appreciate the kind of nuance that is required to approach something like this. Now, I want to further unpack some of the things that you said first. And starting with the umbrella of governance, coming with the domestic part. Now, before we delve into what needs to be done, I want to just take a moment to understand where we stand right now. And in that context, can you tell us what have been the most important changes in the past 7 years under the Modi government?
Oh, absolutely. So I think I would put it under 3 buckets in terms of domestic governance, especially with the focus in the last 7-8 years under the BJP government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. First, I would say hard infrastructure. Then I would say soft infrastructure. Then I would say digital governance and reforms, okay, which is like the software. I think that the hard infrastructure is very important to appreciate how boring it is, but how important it is. Like, unlike the Chinese population, which is along the river valleys and the coasts, so along, South China Sea, East China Sea, basically on the Pacific basin, the Chinese population is basically in the eastern coast. Indian population density, like UP, especially East UP, Bihar, parts of Bengal, is very much along the Ganga Valley, the Indo-Gangetic plains. They are along the river, but they are nowhere close to the sea. And this, for example, all of UP is now 230 to 40 million, I'm guessing in 2021, to maybe to 250 million, perhaps slightly less. Bihar is probably 120 million. And then if you want to add Bengal, another 110 million maybe, right? So that's almost 500 million people, right? Right there, almost 500 million people. And then, of course, there are parts of Rajasthan, MP, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Uttaranchal. So we are talking about, say, 600 million odd people, right, who historically use the rivers for transportation. But what happened is, because of population explosion, for irrigation and drawing out more and more canals, the water flow in the rivers became less and they were no longer navigable for commerce. So what happened is, our industrial base, along with other reasons, we can go to dedicated, like freight equalization, which led to more and more jobs in industries going to existing clusters like Maharashtra and Gujarat, because whether you would get coal from Jharkhand in Calcutta or Bombay, it was the same. And along with bad politics, unionization, whatever we want to discuss, it became so that this 500, 600 million people were cut off from the global economy, effectively. That it was not viable in a cost sense to manufacture deep somewhere in Uttar Pradesh and export from there, or even serve the entire Indian market. So, but because the density population is so high, like for example, Bihar is now approaching almost 2,000 people per square kilometers, in definitely 1,500, right? It's about 90,000 square kilometers with 120, 130 million people. So it's already around 1,400, 1,500 people per square kilometer, and it will reach about 2,000, if I'm not wrong. Just for comparison, New York, greater New York area, not Manhattan, but greater New York area has a population density that's much less than that. And that's the most dense in the US, and that's a metropolitan region. What I'm trying to say is, they're very poor, they're underserved, but they're very dense. So infrastructure here goes a long way. So unlike the Chinese right now, who are building infrastructure to keep GDP targets,
Right.
or how the Americans are different. The Japanese, they have a quotation there, bridge to nowhere. Like you're literally building a bridge because you want to create economic activity.
Yeah.
But in the case of UP, Bihar, Bengal, parts of North India, which are relatively less developed than South India and West India, one good expressway, one good dedicated freight corridor, semi-high speed rail goes a long distance, and we are building that. So that, I think we have really spent a lot of money there, and the fruits of that will be seen. For example, the way the Golden Quadrilateral was made under Vajpayee, but the fruits took time to be visible. And of course, along with that, so that's the hard infrastructure. And the financing of it, including InvITs and REITs, and investment infrastructure trusts and all that. We'll come into finance part later. The soft infrastructure. Obviously, we are going through a pandemic. Hopefully, we are close to it. So there's health, there's education, there is deworming. One of the biggest deworming programs is in the world is in India, which has not been talked about much, but that leads to massive benefits for the child throughout his or her life. But more prosaic things like gas, like cooking gas, like electricity, like pakka road, like toilets, sanitation. So imagine so many people, and of course, something which is not done by the government, but facilitated by the government, very ubiquitous and cheap internet through feature phones partially, but mostly cheap smartphones now.
Right.
So now suddenly this 500 million people, and it's not just one government to be fair, but this government has accelerated the process, in the last 10 years or so have gone from being, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but from village hamlets where they would sew their own clothes and not necessarily consume outside products, to being integrated not just into the Indian economy, but almost to the global economy. In larger Indian hamlets, villages are actually towns. I mean, Indian urbanization rates are actually underestimated by official data because we have some of the most stringent definitions of what constitutes urbanization. Right. So like if you have 5,000 people in a so-called village, that's a town in most parts of the world. Right. So in India, what's happening now is if you're giving a town-like infrastructure and your Amazon and Flipkarts can deliver some stuff there, right. Forget the local guy who's sewing clothes, he or she can also use those better roads. You are suddenly what Adam Smith would call the extent of the market defines the scope of specialization. And specialization defines how productive any economy is, right? So basically, the larger the market, the more interconnected the market, the more any one entity can specialize, and therefore he or she can be more productive. So the biggest change has been on the hard infrastructure and then the soft infrastructure. Now, of course, helping a lot of this is reforms, which will also show, like, for example, GST. Like, we are going through a tough time in the pandemic, but we are seeing record GST numbers right now this year. We saw 2 months of 1.3 lakh crores plus, so almost $20 billion, and which is not just higher compared to last year, but even higher compared to the year before, the pre-pandemic numbers, in a trend adjusted manner. So these are very, very impressive numbers. Direct tax collections. So there is an increase in the fiscal capacity of the state. There is financialization. There are some errors. I think, for example, part of the benefits of demonetization were undone by increasing the top income tax bracket, because ultimately you want money to get out of the black usage. I think when the markets improve, we might also see connecting of the property transactions to your Aadhaar and so on. So the final uses of cash could also be reduced. The idea is to have low but broad tax bases so that all transactions are done formally, a proper amount of taxes are paid to the state, the economy grows, the country grows, and those resources can be used for making our broad citizenry more productive. So welfare, but welfare targeted in a manner, of course, sometimes will be just cash transfers, but targeted in a manner that they are more productive. For example, schools and colleges and health and cooking gas and better roads, etc. So I think getting something like GST or Insolvency Bankruptcy Code or the Real Estate Regulation Act, these are things which have a lot of vested interests. So just pushing that through requires massive political capital, stability. You also have to do a U-turn in a couple of cases, like Narendra Modi has done with the land acquisition and now the farm reforms, right? But that also shows that, okay, I mean, as I say, if you're not getting back from some things, are you even trying hard enough, right? I mean, the fact that you had to kind of withdraw from a couple of things shows that you were really pushing the envelope. So I think really what they've done is getting re-elected with the majority. That by itself gives political stability to India. Then doing these supply side reforms, then doing these hard and soft infrastructure. One criticism I would say is they did not manage the demand side as well as they could have. Like they were partially the culpabilities with the earlier two RBI governors. But even on the fiscal side, I think they were too conventionally quote unquote small c conservative, which generally shows good instincts that at least the prime minister is not trying to win elections purely through fiscal outlays. Although, of course, like any politician, he will tweak it a bit here and there. But over and above politics, I think India has a lot of capacity utilization gap.
Right.
And when exports were stagnant for the last few years until this year, they should have run the demand a bit faster on the fiscal side. But those 2-3 criticisms aside, they've really done a lot of reforms. The infrastructure part is what will really increase India's economic capacity in the 2020s. So I think these are classic short-term pain, long-term gain decisions.
Right.
And the fact that they can do that and get re-elected shows good political management, because that was the curse in people's minds that, look, Vajpayee did all these good things, but he lost the election in 2004. In fact, the credit went to Manmohan Singh's two-term government in many ways, the good stuff that happened in 98 to 2004. And therefore, why should we do it was the narrative, right? So how do you do it? How do you sequence it? How do you pace it, even though some mistakes will happen? And how do you get re-elected to be able to sell it internally in a political sense? I think that is the overall achievement on the political economy side, in my view.
Very interesting, Harsh. And I think what stands out is also the consistency in the last 7 years that we have seen, that it has not been a one-off thing. I mean, we've seen GST, we've seen labor reforms, we've seen things like privatization of certain PSUs. And the process has been going on. So it hasn't really been a one-off thing. And then
so reform is a process. It's not an event.
Yes.
In fact, I mean, I am somebody who speaks a lot about the open capital convertibility, capital account convertibility, and the RBI often says it's a process. It's not an event.
Yeah.
So, like for example, on labor reforms, they're kind of going a bit slow right now. Right. On power reforms, also they're going a bit slow right now, partially because I'm sure politics is one reason. Yeah. The farm reform U-turn is one reason, but the idea is you don't stop. Right. So what happens is cumulatively over 5 years, 7 years, 10 years across sectors, one day you wake up and you realize, oh my God, a lot of reforms have been done, yeah. Even though on any one particular weekday or weekend, it doesn't seem like Big Bang. Yeah. You can have these occasional symbolic Air India privatizations you rightly mentioned or alluded to, which for some people was the litmus test of reform. Yeah. But basically, it's the cumulative impact more than the Big Bang headline. I think that has really moved the needle. Because if you compare it to the 2 terms of UPA, 1 and 2, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had a lot of credibility from his finance minister days. Right. Even though, of course, the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had to give the political capital for that to happen. But really, they did not do much reforms in those 10 years. They were basically coasting along on a global easy cycle, and the reforms and infrastructure investments done earlier. There was infrastructure investments that happened in UPA times, but it was a very credit-driven, bank-driven, which created NPAs later on during Modi's early years. So it was very cronyist, and there was no new reforms at the policy level done. So, sometimes input and output, there is a lag. So, the growth rates are comparable for the 2 administrations so far, but what has gone in is dramatically different. And I'm comparing the Manmohan Singh's 10 years and Narendra Modi's 7.5 years so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the importance of infrastructure is also something that you've brought out very well, because like you said, a mile of highway in India probably will do so much more than it would do in any part of the world. And I think because I think in some ways, population density is generally seen as a bad thing. But I think when it comes to infrastructure, I think it's a great thing, because we live closer far more than maybe somebody in the US, for example. So you mentioned the agricultural reforms, Harsh, and we all have seen how that has been a setback for the government's larger reform agenda as well. So how do you see challenges like these? How big of a setback do you see them as?
See, it's definitely a setback. There is no way to put lipstick on this pig. It's a setback. Right. I think, of course, in retrospect, we can all be wiser.
Right.
One aspect of the retrospective analysis is, it's such a deep reform that you generally should do deep kind of mass impact reforms when the economy is hot, not when it's weak. Because what happens when the economy is hot is, see, agriculture in India is the sector which absorbs the rest of the sector's unemployment. So all the disguised unemployment basically goes to agriculture. So when a young man in his 20s or 30s is unable to find a blue-collar job in the cities, he reverts to his family farm or some kind of, if he does not have a family farm labor work in his or her village, right? I mean, that's how it works. Now, of course, in this case, the opposition was not really from most of India. It was from Punjab and parts of Haryana and West UP, and there were angles of religion and caste as well. But I think broadly speaking, it became an issue where the religion and caste angles were easier to sell,
right,
because the economy as a whole was going through pain, which is inevitable during the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, we were slowing down actually. So because if you want to reform something, it's easier to tell the stakeholders that, you know what, there are other opportunities. If you go to construction is booming right now. But of course, this is all in retrospect. The fact that the Prime Minister tried it, I think, is praiseworthy. The fact that he had to do a U-turn on it, of course, is a setback. But we don't know the intelligence he had or the reasons he did it. There could be national security reasons. One can make a justifiable criticism ki agar you had to do a U-turn, why not do it 6 months earlier and all that? Right. Yes, all those, we can discuss those points, but right. I think broad story is it is a setback. But then if you look at it in the 7-8 year kind of context, this along with the land acquisition, which is the earlier setback, you if you win some, lose some, but so long as you're winning more than you're losing, then, and as I said, if you don't even lose any, then the question is, are you trying hard enough? Right. So this is in a way feedback from the Indian political system. The unfortunate part is the feedback is not just based on raw numbers, but also a veto over law and order. So that's a broader problem that the Indian government has to solve, the union government, the state governments, that, ultimately you have to have rule of law. Everything else depends on it. So that is, I would say that is more worrisome, that there is still a street veto, but of course the issue is more complex than that.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, I mean, that's a larger issue, which also, involves other, and we've seen other examples of that, like the anti-CAA protests, for example, which goes beyond the realm of economic reforms specifically. And also, Harsh, do you think that, I think Margaret Thatcher was the one who said this, that, a government should spend, I think, 3/4 of its time selling reforms and 1/4 of its time doing reforms, or something of that sort? Do you think the government also has to sort of communicate reforms, sell them more proactively?
Yeah, see, I think this government communication is good. I would say it's better than many other governments, but there is obviously scope for better communication. For example, on the farm reforms, the thing that we're discussing, it was not clearly communicated because it was always deliberately ambiguous. For example, what is the MSP, the minimum support price? You cannot buy all farm produce in India at the MSP. The government will go bankrupt the very next day, right? So it has always been don't ask, don't tell. We were historically, after the Green Revolution, for whatever legacy reasons, focused more on undivided Indian Punjab, which later became Haryana as well. In fact, there were reports of wheat and rice being sold from UP and MP in trucks to Punjab, where it would then be procured through the local FCI. So there was a set of vested interests. And when there is vested, you cannot communicate these things to vested interests. They understand it better than you. The question is, do you communicate it to the other people who then, maybe they have less skin in the game, but because of the raw numbers, they just shout out those vested interests. Maybe the government would have done that better in this case. On some other cases, of course, in this case, there was a risk of a religious polarization. And so that then goes out of the ambit of a purely economic reform. Then, there are other factors a politician or statesman has to consider, and good or bad. And even if they do want to create a confrontation, is this the right time or not? So then I don't want to comment on that. But of course, broadly speaking, any reform should be communicated better. But I do think the government has communicated better. but going forward, what you're saying is very true, because many of the easy reforms have been done. Like, for example, right now, public sector banks are to be privatized, at least some of them. Now they are trying to go on a strike.
Right.
How do you communicate to the broader public that it's not unfair, that if anybody loses his or her job, there will be a voluntary retirement scheme, which will be more than generous enough. For example, private sector bankers just get fired. They don't get a VRS, right? These guys will get a proper VRS. We respect their hard work, including during demonetization. We differentiate between them and the union leaders. And we will try to minimize the fighting even there by reallocating them to other segments. So these things, I think, can be done more.
Right.
Of course, and it will only get tougher because the easiest reforms are done, more or less.
Yeah, and I think as with economic reforms in general, the vested interest often tend to be very concentrated, while the benefits are more spread out. They are very significant, but they're more spread out. So I think that also makes it challenging. Harsh, speaking about the financial sector, which you mentioned briefly in particular, now you have written about this quite recently, that about how India is charting out a very unique path in this regard. And many reforms and initiatives again have come about in this sector over the last few years. Can you explain to our viewers what exactly has been the trajectory of these measures in the financial sector?
See, India has been very bank-dominated economy, modern India, just like East Asia and continental Europe. The exception has been that our equity markets, especially in the last few decades, have been very modern, especially since the NSE came in and it's all computerized, and we now have, maybe not comparable liquidity to say the US or South Korea, but we have enough liquidity on our derivatives when it comes to equities. But broader financial structure, what is known as BCD, like the bonds, currency, derivatives. Like just today, I think we suspended futures trading in a few agricultural commodities, right? I mean, which I think is a mistake, because the commodity markets are sending you a signal. Like it's like basically asking the messenger to be shut up. And each time you do this kind of ban, in the future, people don't trust that particular commodity market to always be liquid. But that's a small example. So the point is, we were historically bank dominated, with a bit of an exception on the equity market side. So therefore, what we did not have so much was the bond market. And there are differences between the bond market and the equity market, but our corporates would take loans primarily from banks, right, and not from the bond market. It's now gradually changing. And on the currency and derivative side, obviously, because we are not an open capital account, so our currency markets there are obvious constraints, which you would not if you are trading euro, pound, dollar amongst yourselves. So I think that is the starting point. Now, the problem with banks is, how do you do due diligence for very long gestation projects like infrastructure, like roads, highways, or even real estate in some cases? And what happened on the ground was, because even though our market cap of private sector banks are higher, like maybe 2/3 of the deposits are still in public sector banks. I'm giving you a rough number. So they therefore have to loan that money out. And since your salary as a public sector bank due diligence officer, or your bonus, is not linked necessarily in a directly ROE sense to your department of the bank overall, even if you are an honest person personally, it somewhere gets part of the larger cronyist story, right? Like you, instead of commercial due diligence, in one of my articles I wrote, you ended up doing political due diligence, right? Like, or what some politicians now call phone banking. Like, somebody would call somebody and said, he or she is a friend, he or she, please make sure gets the loan. Right. And that XYZ would get the loan for 100 crore project, which would actually cost 80 crores. So they would overinflate and over invoice, and they would not really put any equity from their pockets. And the project did well, great. They made a lot of money. And even from that project, they would take some cash out, siphon it off. And if it failed, it just became an NPA. Yeah. Right. So it was heads, I win, the private entrepreneur, tails, you, the public sector bank, which is backstopped by the taxpayers of the country, they lose. And therefore undermining the legitimacy of honest competitive capitalism itself, because other people can see this entire model is corrupt and cronyist, right? So there is implicitly, you cannot do long-term due diligence. Further, you're doing it in a public sector setup. It's just a mess of wrong incentives. So what we are doing now in the last few years through the IBC, the bankruptcy code basically allows you to recover more money for every bankruptcy. So fine, let's just go chapter 13 equivalent in the US. You go through a bankruptcy, instead of 20 paisa on a rupee, you probably get 40, 50 paisa on a rupee. So it's not a full write-off. The process is supposed to be faster, and there are many things that the jurisprudence is evolving. Second thing you're doing is what I mentioned earlier very briefly, the infrastructure investment trust, the real estate investment trusts, halfway between a bond and an equity, and halfway between a bank loan and equity. You basically have this thing which gets listed or is unlisted, and you, a retail or institutional buyer, can buy directly the cash flows of commercial rent projects or highway tolls or power lines cash flows. And therefore, it's not exactly a loan, it's not exactly equity. You by law, 90% of the cash flows of that underlying project has to be given to the shareholders every year. So that is a huge revolution that's happening in India's infrastructure and real estate story as we speak. And this government went through many iterations and made the legal structure, the tax incentive structure very sound in the last few years, starting with Arun Jaitley's time to right now. So that is one. So what we're doing is we're going from a continental European, East Asian model to more of an Anglo-American kind of what is known as arm's length bond market versus bank market model, but with a twist. And that twist is the Indian origin twist, is that we have what is known as digital public goods. Right. So we have created this jam trinity, right? This Jandhan. So basically, even the poorest, now hundreds of millions of bank accounts have opened in the last few years. Even if it's a no-frill bank account, Aadhaar or the UID, everybody has a unique identity, something like the American Social Security, but with an electronic infrastructure behind it on day one. And M standing for mobile, increasingly smartphones, but even feature phones. And therefore, you can do cash transfers and everything. But much more than that, you can do something like an eKYC. I can join a bank or a brokerage account sitting at my home, not really signing anything on the paper anymore, because there are ways of identifying that if Harsh is saying he is Harsh, right, there is a digital infrastructure saying, yes, in fact, he is Harsh. And therefore, you kind of reduce the frictions and the cost of opening small accounts. Now, if you take that along with, this thing allows me to open many more equity accounts, which has happened in the last 2 years, which also takes me money into the InvITs and REITs. Right. And slowly we are broad basing our bond markets. And therefore, what is happening is interest rates are coming down. They may need to come down a bit more, although in the short term, there might be a reversal. Is that people are saying, okay, maybe I don't need to put money in a FD on a taxable 5.5% basis. I mean, exceptions being for senior citizens. Why don't I put more and more money in other financial assets, right? So I don't need the intermediation of banks to that extent, because I can directly be taking part in the markets. Most people won't do it actively. They'll just have an SIP, which will just automatically debit some money from the bank account and go to a mutual fund every month. Some people might do it somewhat more passively, somewhat more actively. And then this whole fintech revolution that's happening on top of that, which what happens is these old boring banks, they don't necessarily do the lending. They don't originate the home loan or the last mile retail auto loan. A fintech or an NBFC does it, but then they sell maybe 80% of that to a bank. So they don't keep the full thing on their own books. They sell the kind of securitize it and sell it to a bank. They just keep a small part of it on their own balance sheets, maybe, just to broadly align incentives. So we've gone through an NPA cycle. NPAs are now broadly fine, finally, despite the pandemic. We've gone through the cleaning of IBC. The real estate cycle has gone through a normalization. The fintech revolution is happening. We have new instruments like InvIT and REIT. So now it's much more possible for us to create a portfolio, which is not just a bank account, a real estate, or gold. Right. But there are equities. There are these quasi equities like REITs and InvITs. In fact, Nitin Gadkari just a couple of days ago said, why don't people invest in infrastructure investment trusts, which give you bigger return than banks, and you are in a way investing in the India growth story. So I think, and because we broad base it suddenly, right? Because suddenly people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, who did not even have a bank account 5 years ago, now with one click, they or their children by 2025, almost everybody can own a piece of the India story. And therefore the entire labor versus capital dynamic becomes partially merged or partially diffused, because if you're working on a salaried job, but you have some exposure to equities through SIP or some other products, in a way, you are also on the capital side. And therefore, if there is some policy volatility or some external volatility, if you don't do well on the job side, you do well on the capital side, or vice versa, right? So I think that revolution of mass investing, while still keeping the bank, so we are not throwing away the banks. In fact, we are creating development banks. So what we are saying is, we will keep the continental model. We'll also add the Anglo-American model. We'll add our own digital public goods model, and we will have an all of above approach. So yes, long-term investing happens best through banks and InvITs and REITs, but we need to create $1 trillion of infrastructure in the next 5 years. So why not also add a development bank? A development bank is like not a retail bank. In fact, some retail banks today were development banks in the early 90s, but it focuses on long-term loans, and therefore it has specialized officers who can understand and underwrite risks for long-term gestation projects. So we are basically saying a domestic sovereign wealth fund, a development bank, REITs, InvITs, banks, obviously normal commercial banks, but also bonds, and allowing foreign investors to invest in Indian bonds, starting with sovereign bonds, so that interest rates are also merging slowly as India becomes a bigger part of the world economy. So this is a very unique model, which I think the Chinese, for example, do have digital financial. Their digital public goods were mostly with 2 or 3 companies. Now Xi Jinping is trying to crack down on them, precisely because he does not want that infrastructure to remain private. We on day one, for example, the reason MasterCard and Visa don't like RuPay or the UPI, which has crossed $1 trillion annualized transfer number in terms of value, and increasingly in terms of volume as well, is that because that 2% or 1%, whatever the MDR, whatever the underlying fees are, the specific jargon of that micro market, is just being disintermediated by this Indian public goods. And in fact, we are talking about exporting that to Dubai and Singapore to begin with. So what India is saying is, you guys build startups on top of this infrastructure, but the basic infrastructure, you let the public hold it.
Right.
So you don't charge me money for transferring from X to Y, because I can do that very well. In fact, the blockchain CBDC, the central bank digital currency, is the next logical step in this. But it has to be done in a very piecemeal manner, because if you have a CBDC, then you don't necessarily need a checking account with your local bank. It's like having an account with the RBI directly. It's like instead of a Paytm wallet, you have an RBI wallet. So there's no sovereign risk with the RBI, unlike the other banks for which you need some kind of deposit insurance. So to summarize, we are keeping the bank model. We are having new innovative models, including many Anglo-American ones. And then we are putting a digital public goods on top of it all, which even the Chinese have not been able to do. Forget the Americans. Like, I've lived in the US, UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, it's all changing, but nowhere has been transferring or paying money, especially small amounts of money, being so quick, so cheap, and so easy and instantaneous as it has been in India. So we should celebrate this digital public goods infrastructure of India. Hats off to technocrats like Nandan Nilekani and politicians like Narendra Modi, who, despite some early opposition from the BJP, understood the value of the proposition and doubled down on it and saved the taxpayer a lot of money, and is basically making India leapfrog conventional banking. So I think that combination is very unique, where we are not going by the textbook of anybody else. We are taking whatever works and we are writing our own textbook.
Absolutely. And I think that's how it should be.
Yes.
And I think the role of technology, I think, comes out very clearly, even in the transformation that we've seen in the financial sector. And I could relate to so much that you were saying at a very personal level as well. I remember, me wanting to open a Demat account for a very long time. And I was just too lazy to go and do it, like when I was out of college. But then suddenly I could do it sitting at home. And same with the verification of things like the Paytm account. You could just hold up a phone and the camera sort of verifies it for you. So I think that obviously, and the multiplier effect of something, transformations like that, I think it's unimaginable. Harsh, so clearly, the transformation in financial sector is so linked to technology. So one can imagine how technology plays and what kind of a role technology plays in the economic growth and transformation in the larger scheme of things as well. And not a lot of people, like you said, realize that India's payment systems or India's digital services, a lot of them are not just on par with the world, but they're actually leading in many ways. So can you tell us more about these innovations and also more broadly about how technology matters in the India growth story?
See, I think what happened is, this is a classic case of inertia of existing good systems. So the American financial system is good enough. Obviously, it's the world's richest economy. But for example, when I was living in Houston, it was just a pain to open a bank account and make small transfers. Really, the websites were from a different era altogether. This is like as late as 4 years ago, right? And of course, there is now Venmo and other apps, but even PayPal is not as innovative as many of Indian apps are. So what happens is, when you start from a low base, technology allows you to leapfrog. So it's not necessarily that Indians are better. It's just that you just don't have to unlearn some things.
Right.
In fact, in many ways, Indian regulators have been too conservative, I would say, because if you remember, payments through cell phones actually took off, maybe not to this volume, even earlier in parts of Africa, like in Kenya, and like this, the Vodafone, this ePay, I'm forgetting the name of the product.
M-Pesa or something.
M-Pesa and all that, right? They just kind of boomed in Africa because they had an even more underdeveloped infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying regulators should allow everything. They have to be careful, but in some ways, if you want to do a counterfactual analysis, who knows how much more development could have happened in India already had the regulators been perhaps a bit more open-minded. And of course, I'm sure that's changing to some extent. So I think that's on the financial side. Really, the biggest benefit that we had was we decided we can leapfrog, and the pipelines, the basic utilities, we will not keep that for profit. That we will, it's like if you want to privatize, you privatize slots on the railway. You don't privatize the railway line itself, right? The basic infrastructure you keep, because that's how the economics work. Otherwise, it's very easy to monopolize. So I think that's on the financial side. I think more broadly, technology is extremely important, both endogenously and exogenously. What I mean by that is, of course, India being on a per capita basis poor, although with a industrial, technological, and financial elite that's increasingly on par with the world, but most of the population being very poor by global standards, a lot of the technology is all about absorbing the already big gap. But at the same time, because it's such a big market in an aggregate basis, not on a per capita basis, there's a lot of frugal engineering happening, right? Which is not just jugaad. Jugaad is not necessarily systematic, but something much more. So often what started with BPOs in India for multinationals then became KPOs, now became GCCs. And now a lot of entrepreneurs are spinning off from those back offices and then mid offices and then research and development offices that all these companies have in Bangalore and Hyderabad and Pune and Gurgaon, right? So, and entrepreneurs come out of that. So I think that human talent is there, the market is there, the leapfrogging is there. But on technology more broadly, see, technology can be broken into two buckets. So one is, I would simply say, some people call it bits and bytes, right? I mean, in a sense that bytes are data, even though bits are data as well, but bits are like physical bits. So there is physical stuff which moves by energy, and there is data/communication. So in many ways, actually, the world at large over the last half century, I think man last went to the moon in 1972, if I'm not wrong. In the last 50 years has been about globalization and about assimilation or diffusion of existing technologies, many of which were formed during World War II and Cold War. And then civilian applications were democratized across the world, with, of course, the United States of America playing a large part in it for its own selfish commercial and geopolitical reasons, but for whatever reasons, they've created that contribution. Now what we are seeing is, in a way, while the data story will continue, right, with 5G, now augmented reality and virtual reality, which will be huge for India, because if you and I can have an even better chat, right, it's almost like if Kamal is sitting in front of me, then it's not just a podcast. We could work like this every day almost. Again, human touch is there, all that is there, but then, and if we could talk like that, then you could be in Boston and I could be in Bangalore, right? So far, blue collar jobs have been outsourced. Relatively few white collar jobs have been outsourced from the West, right? Because they have been mostly back office and some mid office jobs. But imagine if distance really becomes much less relevant. It will never fully happen. There will never be a completely flat world. There's always geopolitics and trade policy, but technology matters, and that will lead to a massive further exploitation for India's benefit of that labor arbitrage. So that's on the data side. And of course, within India itself, you could also go to smaller towns. You don't have to be in South Bombay or South Bangalore or South Delhi or Gurgaon. The other part, which I think is very interesting, is ultimately growth is about energy, right? I mean, moving stuff and people from point A to point B. Right. That's historically been a huge part. In many ways, the Industrial Revolution was because of coal, right? The second Industrial Revolution was because of oil, right? The third Industrial Revolution was nuclear and electricity and so on and so forth. Because of climate reasons, because of other geopolitical reasons, we are at a point where we are at the precipice of cheap energy, right? Solar, wind plus battery, not to mention the comeback of nuclear. Right. That combination together can lead to much cheaper energy in, say, another 10 years from now, maybe at half the cost, even cheaper than natural gas. And when I say cheaper than natural gas, I mean cheaper than natural gas at North American prices. By the time they land in Asia, it's already more expensive. It comes via Australia or the LNG or whatever. So really, really cheap energy, it dramatically reduces India's import costs, if not in absolute terms, but in terms of percentage of GDP, because India is one of the few emerging markets which is not a commodity play. It's actually an anti-commodity play. India is a human capital story. It's not a commodity story. It's not a Brazil or Russia. It's not even a less poor form of Australia or Canada, right? It's a human capital story. So for us, falling of energy costs is an absolute boom. Right. And that's actually what the world is focusing on. Yeah. From German subsidies to Chinese subsidies to American subsidies to Indian PLI schemes now. Yeah. So the falling cost of energy is a big tailwind for the India story. It's a big tailwind for humanity. Yeah. It's a double tailwind for India. Yeah. So that energy story, now hydrogen is being added to it. So hydrogen and solar and wind and storage and nuclear on the energy side. On the data side, I mentioned 5G, AR, VR, and then of course the financial and the broader startup ecosystem that we discussed. So these are things which ultimately will make, travel, transportation from point A to point B easy. Right now, it seems difficult and even stupid to say that, because we're living through a temporary energy spike phase in the last few months. But the long-term trend is very clear, like commodity and energy prices fall, especially as a percentage of global GDP over very long periods. Right. That basically is the story of growth, because then you have more stuff left for consumption, luxury, discretion, and more importantly, reinvesting in the rest of humanity for future growth. So I think those two are basically at the precipice of acceleration. And that's why I'm especially more bullish for India, which starts from a low base, but has the basic infrastructure in an institutional sense to mostly exploit it, not fully exploited, to mostly exploit it. Africa is also starting from a very low base, but it does not have that population density. It is not one country, although an African free trade union was recently signed, Nigeria signing at the last moment. And then their demographic transition is further couple of decades behind. So parts of Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East and Muslim world, I'm sure eventually they'll also join the story, but those are broader social political changes which will also have to take place in the India seems to be, despite various problems, at that right point right now.
Very, very fascinating, Harsh. And I think very interesting times ahead. A lot of these are going to play out in the next few years. And I think particularly the transformation in the connectivity, especially the digital connectivity, I think we've seen that in the last couple of years in front of our eyes, the way some of these technologies have accelerated. And it'll be interesting to see where it's further headed. Harsh, when we talk about economic growth in India, especially, there are two big elephants in the room. I personally look at them as huge challenges. and that is the judiciary and bureaucracy. Now, and I'm sure you would agree that judiciary is not only slow moving for businesses, but also for citizenry in general. And so is bureaucracy. And in fact, I personally don't like the word bureaucracy very much, because I think it should be civil service, even in the common usage. But that apart, how do you see reforms and changes in these two domains? I mean, what kind of changes do we need? And do you think it's time that we bring in these changes?
See, absolutely. Ultimately, growth, and we did not get much time to delve on this because it's an entire topic by itself. My thesis is growth basically happens because of state capacity.
Right.
So in a way, we talked a lot about technology, but the state is the ultimate meta technology.
Right.
We forget that the state is a creation and invention of us humans, right? It's a way of us collectively acting. The idea is the state must be accountable, limited, but strong.
Right.
And what happens is some people focus on the strong part and some people focus on the limited and accountable part, whereas we need all two or three. It has to be powerful, but it has to be limited by accountability.
Yes.
So that is the combination in a way that we are trying to create through democracies. Even China, which is a big exception to this kind of accountable thesis, is right now going through the transition where they had a collective leadership for the last 3 leaders. And right now, the current leader, Xi Jinping, might actually break precedent by going for a 3rd term. And all kinds of downstream effects on the institutional structure of the CCP-led state. We don't know what comes in the future after that, right? So it's early days for this clearly big exception to an accountable state also growing. But broadly speaking, that combination, how do you make a state accountable? As you mentioned, the civil service and the judiciary should be effective, should be as honest as possible, should be expeditious. And I think let's start with the judiciary first. Why is judiciary so important? If you and I, for example, and I always give this example in a very broad sense, how do you broad base entrepreneurship? Right? Forget the startup ecosystem, which has its own momentum, thank the gods. But let's say you are doing a boring wholesale trade business somewhere, right? And you want to trade with me and we don't know each other. Historically, that has happened in India because you had some social capital with each other, like you belong to the same caste or subcaste.
Right. And
therefore, if you kind of defrauded each other, there was some social way of naming and shaming the other person in a marriage or in somebody's birth or death ceremony, right? You don't want to show your face because you've shamed the community. That's how you ended up doing business. But that's not a very efficient way of doing business, because then not everybody can take part in contracts with you. And therefore, the contract ultimately has to be enforced by a modern state. Of course, arbitrations are good. Of course, it never reaches there, it's good. But if it comes down to it, it should not be a paper which is worthless. Right. It has to be worth something. Now, part of it is simply capacity. We don't have enough judges, especially in the middle and lower parts of the judiciary. So quality and quantity, maybe part of it is just salary. Like, they may still be corrupt, some of them, but at least you start their starting salary, and same with civil service. So capacity, salary, incentives, training. Part of it is actually what we discussed earlier, digitalization.
Right.
You just make sure everything is on a file which is digital, which is mutually verifiable, automatically updated, because a lot of time goes away in process. And the more there is wastage and discretion in process, the more gameable the system is. So, and that is being done, but perhaps too slowly. And of course, a big part is this entire jurisprudence process and how do the senior judges appoint themselves. And that might go more into political philosophy, but it is relevant to the economic angle, because when using the problematic basic structure doctrine, when the Supreme Court said the NJAC is unconstitutional, despite it being a constitutional amendment passed on a bipartisan, all-partisan basis, right. I think that led to some tensions between the legislature and executive, which in India are mostly the same. It's another topic. And the judiciary, because what the politicians were saying was, you basically canceled my NJAC, I'll sit on your appointments for some time. Right. And ultimately that's a lose-lose proposition for everybody. Yeah. So I think that is also related, that you have to be accountable. Like, you cannot effectively be a new caste system in India where the judges are the highest caste, because everybody else has to disclose their financials in public life, but judges may or may not, and it's kind of voluntary, and if they wake up with the right mood, they may or may not. So these things have to be properly dealt with. I think one of the reasons the judiciary kind of got out of hand, and of course there are many good things with the Indian judiciary, don't get me wrong, is along with ideological reasons and along with general confusion at the highest level, because the politics side was very fragmented in coalition governments for a long time. So when you did not want to take politically tough steps, it was convenient even for the politician to get the judiciary stamp on it. But the moment you create that precedent, then you've already kind of given up that power, which ideally was not with that branch of government. So I think it's a capacity, it's an ideology, it's a digitalization, training and pay, all of them apply to judiciary. And it's very important. But before going to the civil service part, one last point I'll mention is, if you do the digitalization part well enough, for example, if you link the real estate transactions to your Aadhaar, which I'm sure will happen in the next 5 years at some point, and then you have a clear transactions, you have what is known as torrent system of land record. So the record is not just of transfers, but who owns it. And the government basically guarantees the title of the land. Half of the, well, not half, but a large number of the litigation will dry up because it's just property litigation. The other big source of property litigation is just one government department or branch against another government department or branch. Like state governments versus federal government, or a PSU against another PSU. These are areas where somebody senior sits down, gets two heads together, and they just sign up a deal without having to go through the motions. Now that requires more credibility on the government side of them being honest and political more capital, because then some journalists will not say, why did you not take the next step of going through the process of maximizing your return in a narrow sense, right? So you needed, for example, Narendra Modi's credibility to sign a Rafale deal on a G2G basis, because the previous defense minister and prime minister were just so frozen by actual corruption and corruption allegations that they just did not do a defense acquisition deal of that magnitude. So it's just getting rid of that complacency and that paralysis is also a big part. Now on the civil service side, large part of it is applicable there as well. But I would say we need more focus on specialization.
Yes.
So yes, some of them have to be generalists. We need more focus on lateral entry, but it's very difficult. It's a very culture shock of outsiders not being easily allowed or assimilated, because there is a sense of entitlement that we've given up the private sector perks and why are people coming and going in. But that allows talent to diffuse. There are pros and cons of everything. Again, there are angles of salary and bonuses here as well. But I think most importantly, even within the civil service, the permanent civil service, we have to get rid of this IAS fascination. In the sense, what I mean by that is have more branches. Why not have an Indian health service, Indian public health service? Like if you automatically have more verticals, more specialization is guaranteed, right? And I am not at all for a moment saying that good journalists are not needed,
right,
but not as many as there are currently.
Yeah.
And again, part of it is just capacity. For example, I know I spoke to an Indian trade service cadre. Firstly, often they would, the other non-IAS cadres would be kind of junior or less prestigious, or they would not necessarily go to negotiate actual trade deals, for example.
Right.
But even when they did, they said we were just not enough people. Like the Chinese or Japanese guy, somebody told me, would know everything about my positions, even me personally, and my junior sitting behind me. And India has a position on bananas historically versus oranges, etc. And we were basically just winging it because we simply were not enough people. So, when you're spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year, not having good human talent, both quantity and quality at the top, is a big mistake.
Yes.
So our government is very bloated at the bottom. We don't need more people to make tea for the officers in our offices. There are coffee machines. You can just buy a coffee machine. But we need more talent to do the thinking part, to do the research part, to feed into the decision-making process. And again, this is a long reform. It takes a lot of political capital. All of them have massive vested interests internally. You send 5 ideas, 4 get rejected. So I think it's just another attrition game, and you just have to stay at it.
Absolutely. I think we can just be hopeful that these are two areas which will receive the attention of the government in the remainder of
because reforms are much more than economic reforms. There are also state capacity administrative reforms, so.
And like you said, I think the state is one technology which I think India has to master.
Yes.
To maximize what we can get out of it.
Yes.
And you mentioned trade, and that brings me to my next question. I've heard the same, that India has very few people and often not very well versed with the issues at hand. And you have the US and Chinese who have like large armies of trade negotiators. They are specialized in such so deeply. And I think this is something that again becomes very important in the kind of world we are in today. There's a lot of churning happening, geopolitical changes, and globalization itself is in a flux. In an environment like this, how do you see India, and how can India approach external trade? Because at the end of the day, that is also very important. I mean, we can always debate about how much of a role it plays in our economic growth, but I think it does play a role, and often we have seen that India, in terms of negotiating its FTAs, trade agreements, has not benefited a lot. And somewhere I think it's the process of trade negotiation, also the research that goes into it, where India has found to be lacking. So how do you think India can approach this?
See, on trade, obviously, there are many components to it. One component obviously is how do you optimize on your negotiation? So that's what you mentioned in the question, right? What I answered in the last question is you have more number and more trained and experienced negotiators, so that you get best out of a bad situation, right? So, which is at best, any trade deal is always never a perfect situation because everybody has competing interests. So that's one, state capacity. The second is what are your a priori growth conditions in terms of domestic infrastructure, soft and hard, and also the currency, because you see, you could have a 10% tariff, or you could have a 10% cheaper currency. They are conceptually similar. Right. So what's your macroeconomic take on the currency? Are you in a forex accumulation phase, which will then lead to an open capital account? Is your real effective exchange rate much more higher than it should be because of secular appreciation and so on and so forth? These are technical macroeconomic areas, but unfortunately, we tend to deal with them in silos. Like the macro part goes to the RBI, Ministry of Finance, and then the Ministry of Commerce is left to handle the trade part. But you have to have a whole of government, if not a whole of society economy approach to deal trade. So there is, how do you make your own infrastructure and productive capacity better in terms of policies, currency, then negotiate good deals? And then what is the geopolitical land? What does history teach us? Two more questions. The geopolitical situation is you have the world's second largest economy in market exchange rates, China, communist China, largest in purchasing power parity terms, which is openly mercantilist, which uses tariff and non-tariff barriers when it suits it for imports, forces indigenization of technology, uses economic coercion, latest being, I think, with some Baltic countries who dared to do some friendship deal with Taiwan. And basically same with Japan and South Korea. When they get unhappy, they would either block tourists or would block some rare earth minerals to be exported to Japan and so on and so forth because of some dispute on Senkaku Islands. India is in a unique situation because India actually runs a trade deficit with China. Most of these other countries I mentioned, especially Japan, South Korea, if I'm not wrong, run closer to a trade surplus. So what it means is India has leverage on China, even though it may not be a big part of Chinese overall trade, because India imports much more from China than it exports to. And India also wants to get, India will basically 10, 15 years behind China. It wants to make sure it grows through that trajectory and not slow down. And of course, we have a land border dispute, and they help Pakistan with nuclear bombs and missiles and have directly now started attacking us and the LOC. So clearly a very free trade, laissez-faire policy with China, where they are kind of, have a completely, let's just build 100 steel mills 5 years ago kind of mindset. You cannot have that mindset. So India wants free trade, but minus China. How do you do that? It's very difficult, right? Because that's one of the reasons why we did not sign RCEP. Uh, so which is why now India is looking more west for trade deals. UK, especially after Brexit, is more interested in signing up deals. EU will be more bureaucratic. US even less interested. Canada might be. Australia will be. UAE. So we are looking at those deals. But so that's on the geopolitical side. And because we need to, what happens with once you get somehow incentivized production in your own country, it creates its own momentum. It has its own ecosystem of components and ancillaries and suppliers, and therefore production and consumption, which goes to your region. So that brings me to economic history, which is the last point of this answer. No country, no large country that I know of has become rich without some industrial trade policy. And this is very interesting to note because popular narrative is very different. So when you mentioned Thatcher in one of the earlier questions, we think of Thatcher and Reagan, and this, I personally don't think the word neoliberal makes a lot of sense because it has a different connotation by now, very politicized. Right. But this kind of classical liberal, moderate libertarian economic revolution, or some call neoliberal, of the 80s, it happened in a very uniquely Western context where their basic infrastructure was already built out, where they were already dominant economies, right? In that framework, doing free trade and focusing less on infrastructure, et cetera, was very different. So the earliest version of that was 1840s, the UK doing the Corn Laws and opening up its agriculture, which led to the starting of the Economist magazine, where you earlier used to work. UK was at its dominant peak at that time. In 1940s, the US does it when it was at its peak. And the Chinese are now trying to do it because they are at the global manufacturing peak right now. Now they're trying to do it after, not even now, not fully. They still want to get the Teslas in, get the technology, but at least they're now trying to do it. But what happened? The UK became rich in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s through deliberate acts of incentivizing wool value add, then cotton value add, textile value add, Calico Acts, banning trade against India, forcing opium trade on China. The Americans go to Japan, force up Japan to open, dump their industrial products there. Throughout the 19th century, on a weighted average tariff basis, America had a tariff of 40% on its imports. And this is the time when you did not have these massive ships with very cheap container shipping. Okay. So shipping was not as cheap as it is today. I mean, forget the last few months. Yeah. So you had basically these countries, and Alexander Hamilton basically wrote that manual. And then there was another Frederick List, a German American, who kind of perfected it. Abraham Lincoln was of that mindset that you need some protection, because remember, they did not have an income tax till 100 years ago. That federal revenues used to come from tariffs. Okay. So the UK, US, and then of course all of East Asia. Right. Germany had something called the Zollverein, which was like the Hanseatic League but inland, and it basically said all German states within each other trading would be without customs, but outside would have customs. Right. Which is the prototype of the modern day European Union, the Euro commerce area, right? The free trade area. So the idea always has been, if you have a large enough market inside, or large enough potential inside, you try to incentivize others by saying, don't make your cell phone in South Korea and export it here. Why don't you make it here? And if you don't, I'll slap a 10% tariff on you. Right. You can still import it. We are not against you at all. And we are fully in favor of you if you yourself manufacture it here. India's biggest car manufacturer is Japanese, Suzuki. Yeah. Number 2 is Hyundai, South Korean. It's not. Number 1 and number 2 are not Indians. So maybe Mahindra and Tata will do well in the coming years because of the EV revolution, but they make those cars in India. Yeah. So unlike the car where we had these tariffs, we signed what is known as ITA 95-96 under the WTO aegis, the Information Technology Agreement, where we went to basically zero tariffs on electronics. Right. So at the end of the 90s, we had less value add in the electronic manufacturing sector than we had in the beginning of the 1990s. Okay. So it helped us with computers and phone imports, yes. But if we had a more calibrated program, we would not have to do these PLIs today. Right. That white electronic good ecosystem could have also been manufactured in India 20 years earlier, along with if we had invested in infrastructure. So the entire Indian liberalization story also looks much brighter in retrospect because of services exports,
Right.
which kind of took our eyes off from manufacturing, what is happening in manufacturing until relatively recently.
Right.
So that's how I see trade policy. Like you have, see, if you are a Singapore, you have to play by free trade. But domestically, if you're good state capacity, what is private and what is public does not matter. Right? I call it quantum economics, in the sense that where matter energy kind of diffuse, it's so small.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're very big, the other end of relativity, it's like gravitational economics. You become your own planet and other countries become moons around you. So what happens is it has geoeconomic and geopolitical implications, I'm sure, which you'll study in your PhD program. Why does Pakistan not want to trade with India easily? Because it understands if it trades with India, for it, the India trade will always be much more important than for India, the Pakistan trade, irrespective of the bilateral deficit or surplus.
Yeah.
And if India ever chooses to kind of switch off that trade during some tensions, the Pakistani economy will be much more hurt than the Indian economy, even though the Indian economy will also be hurt, but the Pakistani economy will be much more hurt. And therefore, India will have more leverage to that extent. And so I think it's very important that trade, along with religion and war, these 2-3 basic things are why states were created and wars were fought.
Right.
And you can always kind of fine tune it in a more humane manner, but to take away trade autonomy is one of the first things a imperialist or neo-imperialist actor does with a weaker actor. So India, in many ways, keeping that autonomy, but that does not mean abusing it for its own harm, is very important. We will have moderate tariffs, we might have time-bound tariffs, but it's important to incentivize production in India in this China plus one post-COVID world without losing sight of the supply chains. So we're basically trying to act east geopolitically, but trade more west now geoeconomically. So that's the kind of balance our policymakers are trying right now.
Absolutely, Harsh. And I think you've brought it so beautifully that how it has to not be dogmatic, but rather much more nuanced. And like I think you mentioned, previously you were talking about the financial sector and how India has sort of developed a own trajectory. I think trade again is one such area where things will be nuanced. They have to be nuanced and not the dogmatic way in which I think sometimes the extremes sort of projected to be. Thank you so much for that, Harsh. Coming back to this state, Harsh, and shifting subjects slightly and approaching it from a civilizational and a cultural perspective. The title of your latest book, A New Idea of India, is also talking about a civilizational state, something that is also increasingly popular in India today. So for the benefit of our viewers, both Indian as well as foreign viewers, can you explain what exactly you mean by a civilizational state and why is that important for India?
See, the modern nation state first appeared in the European theater, right? So what happened was the nation state there had certain connotations based on ethno-linguistic homogeneity.
Right.
So, from the Treaty of Westphalia to the Second World War and all the population exchanges that happened, peacefully or not so peacefully, and I would include more broadly even Turkey in that entire process. The idea was you have this kind of relatively homogeneous population which speaks one language, more or less has the same religious affiliation, although that became less important in the age of enlightenment, so to speak. And this community is the nation which creates a state for itself. It's like a soul or a body which creates a backbone. The backbone is the state. Now, in India, and then of course, they had this massive, aggressive 2 world wars. And then people were like, well, this nationalism doesn't really seem very attractive because I am a German and he's a French and we are friends. So this nationalism only led to Hitler, right? And then when people call themselves nationalists in India, which perfectly fine, and they should, and I also call myself a nationalist, I don't believe in this nationalist versus patriot false dichotomy. But what other people then hear, not that we should care too much about that, but nonetheless being aware of it, is, nationalist equal to aggressive for no reason whatsoever. So what I want, I with my co-author Rajiv Mantri write in this book, A New Idea of India, the subtitle being Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. The rights being relevant to the state, right? Duties are something we do at a societal level. The idea is that, okay, there is a state, a modern state, a democratic state. What is it that is the basis of this modern state? And it's not a nation, because in a European sense, France and Romania might correspond to, I don't know, like Punjab and Telangana, right? Because in India we had a linguistic reorganization of states in the 50s and 60s, right? So in a European sense, their nations are our states. And in fact, in some sense, the European Union is now copying the Indian Union, because they are now actually trying to become a super state, which India already made itself after partition and independence with the Republic in the 1950s. So what is it that India is? India is a civilization. What is a civilization? A civilization, unless you're talking in the sense of human civilization, a civilization is the largest subset possible, a largest coherent subset possible of humanity. Right. So basically, if you above that subset, it's all of humanity. So I would, of course, the Indian civilization, you could include parts of Nepal, Bhutan, maybe parts of what was earlier known as Indochina, right? At least parts of Sri Lanka, Myanmar. And even if you take out Islamic Bangladesh and Pakistan, clearly parts of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, the Hindu Buddhist culture, you could put that, but broadly that civilization is what currently maps to the Indian nation, broadly speaking, 95% of it, 90% of it, depending on how you define it. So India is a unique country where the entire civilization, almost the entire civilization, corresponds to one state. China is clearly another one. The West is not. The West has the United States. It has the European Union, which also it's not one state, but then there's also Canada and Australia and so on and so forth. There's no longer a direction also in that sense. And of course, there are like subsets of, okay, Anglo-American countries or the Commonwealth and the US separately, the continental ones, or Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, if you want to include Russian, a broader West. In India, it's broadly speaking one civilization in one state. And unlike China, which is not a democratic republic, it's kind of a fake people's republic. India is the only civilizational republic in the world. Maybe Israel to some extent, maybe Japan to some extent, but Japan is part of the broader Confucian worldview. If you take out the political structure, and the West now calls itself Greco-Roman as much as it calls itself Judeo-Christian. So Israel is to some extent a subset. Like, you cannot put India under anything else. Japan was called part of the honorary West by some people. Some people who talk about the Anglosphere talk about India as an honorary member, but really beyond a point, it's a very unique and large enough entity to stand on its own. So in that sense, it is a civilization, and it is one of the few civilizations that maps to one state, which is going from a civilization, remaining one, to a modern nation state as well, but unlike China, through a democratic route. So it's a unique civilizational republic. So it was not created in 1947, 1950, 1952, even rebirth in 1977. It's thousands of years old. Our leaders at the time of independence from the British, or at the time of partition, were not founding fathers in that sense. They could at most be called the founding fathers of the republic. They cannot be called the founding fathers of India. Right? I mean, the first chapter of my book is called India, that is Bharat, which is in the Indian constitution. And it basically says, right? I mean, so you're recognizing that there is a pre-existing entity called Bharat. That this is just the latest chapter, the latest version. You might not have a unified state to that extent earlier. Maybe the Mauryas came close. Guptas came even less close. The Mughals came close, but then it was under a very different kind of ideology, which is not in consonance with the Dharmic spirit of Bharat. So in that sense, it's something very new, but the civilization is ancient. So that's what I mean by the Indian civilization, which now has a state. It may not be a perfect civilization state by any extent. It may not be completely cognizant or self-aware and always acting in its own interests. It can get better as a civilization state, but it is a civilization state, because after the British left and the partition happened mostly on this kind of Dharmic religions versus Abrahamic religions kind of breakup, right? I mean, the India-Pakistan border in that sense is the sharpest civilizational divide in the world, because we have a very kind of pluralist polytheistic society here, and you have a very sharp monotheism there. Even though, ironically, culture is very similar in North India and Pakistan. So it shows that there's a difference between culture and civilization as well. Like culture is more skin deep. You could love the same food or movies, but you could still have a completely different worldview at your core. So that worldview is a civilization which has a state. And to that extent, India is a civilization state.
Absolutely, Harsh. And I think, as you have said in the past, it is so important to engage with the state, own it, and realize its potential. And not just for, I mean, some of the things that we have discussed, but even for civilizational resurgence. I think the role that the Indian state has to play is going to be very important. And like you said, by no means is the civilizational state perfect the way it is right now. But I think that applies to a lot of domains and not just civilization.
Yes.
So I also want to ask you, Harsh, about some of your recent initiatives, and particularly about your second Substack, which is called Dharmatva. Yeah. And the themes you're exploring in that, they're very fascinating. Can you tell us more about it? And in your view also, if you could tell us why Dharma is so important for India and also the world.
See, that's the first thing that I must mention is that I'm by no ways a trained religious scholar. I don't even know Sanskrit beyond a very introductory level. But nonetheless, we are an Indian citizen and adult who tries to make sense of what India means, what our lives means, what is the purpose of our lives, and what does it mean to be a Hindu, which I see as a subset of Dharma, capital D Dharma. And therefore, it is important for us to engage at a popular, educated layperson level and revise our own thoughts. Like I've already changed my own views on many topics multiple times. If you've been reading and writing for 10, 15 years, that happens. So what is Dharmatva? I was very conscious about the fact that, there are people are talking about dismantling global Hindutva, which happened in the last few months, right? So I own the term Hindutva. I think around 10 years ago, I would have said, for example, not that it is relevant, but I've always been BJP supporting.
Right.
That's been my bias. I've never been a member of the party. But even when I was always supporting the BJP, I was like, well, let us do these things like Uniform Civil Code and remove Article 370 and claim the Ram Mandir on a historical ownership basis. Mm-hmm. But I've been for quote unquote genuine secularism, which is interesting separation of state and religion. And we can discuss that later on. And to that extent, when I saw Hindutva as being anti-secular, which I no longer do, I was like, well, maybe Hindutva is not the right word. But then I changed my views over the last 10 years because I realized the people who call themselves anti-Hindutva are basically anti-Hinduism. Okay. That any Hindu assertion on any reasonable level is understood by them to be prima facie in and of itself malified. Right. That it is something that is just not, to use a non-Hindu word, it's not kosher, it's not halal. Right. And so I changed my views in Hindutva, but I also thought often that, a Hindu word itself is a Persian word. It comes from the river Sindhu. It is a geographical word. And we call Dharma to be Sanatan Dharma, right? Yes. Dharma, which means it's timeless. It's for all situations. Yeah. It's interesting that 100 years ago, actually, Sanatani had an orthodox connotation, actually. Right. Sanatanis then were those who would defend what they saw as timeless, which was, a very kind of birth-based, lineage-based Varna system, and women having certain duties, men having certain duties. But the way we kind of see, and this is broader than Neo-Vedanta, right. Sanatan Dharma now is seen, I see it in a Sri Aurobindo sense. Right. And Sri Aurobindo famously said in his Uttar Para speech that actually he said that he also came to the realization that nationalism is actually to that extent a subset of Sanatan Dharma. Right. And he said, I give you today that what is nationalism? It is Sanatan Dharma. and that as Sanatan Dharma expands, India expands. As it shrinks, India shrinks. And interestingly, he said, if it were capable of being destroyed, he did not agree that it can be destroyed, but he said, if it were capable of being destroyed, India would be destroyed.
Right.
So, if you want to then think of it in a timeless sense, what is it exactly that makes us us, and people who we see as not in consonance with Dharma, them?
Yes.
Right? What is it that separates us? Because then you're talking at the level of superstructure, not any subset of rituals or beliefs or texts, which are all very important at that subset level.
Yes.
So I came to the conclusion that the real difference is when we talk of moksha, we talk of any kind of thing that is important for us spiritually,
right,
we are saying always that it is important for me.
Yes.
It does not cross our mind that if somebody else does not do it, he or she is destined to burn in hellfire for eternity. Right. I think that extra thing which is added by especially the two proselytizing Abrahamic monotheisms, is what is very unique in world history. It is what is known as the Mosaic distinction, based on a European scholar's view, Jan Assmann. And he basically said, it initially started with Judaism, although Judaism little evolved, where Judaism was very much seen as always deliberately crafted in opposition partially to Egyptian polytheism and polytheism in that region. And polytheism itself has a problematic, because I'm a polytheist, but some people interpret it differently. There is a better term called henotheism, whereby you can believe in multiple gods, but there may be an underlying same reality. But monotheism, everybody understands, is not just one God, but one exclusive God, right, or one exclusive truth, or one exclusive prophet and way of doing things, or at least a final prophet and way of doing things. So in that sense, a capital D dharma, not small d many dharmas, which might be very, very different dharmas, a capital D dharma, or the essence of that dharma, and therefore the dharmatva, the tattva of that dharma, is in that sense a negative definition.
Right. In
that sense, that so long as there is mutual respect and not just toleration, and many people have spoken about this, yes, that is basically the essence, that you are non-violent in a non-initiating sense, that you are okay for violence in the way of defending, but you would never initiate violence, and you are for mutual respect. That to me are the very basic common denominators, the building blocks of the superstructure of Dharma. This is, of course, not something, this is not useful at all from my day-to-day ritual perspective. It does not tell me if I have to wake up and say, Om Ganapati Namo Namah, or, should I worship Shivji, or should I worship Ram, or should I not worship anybody, or what day should I fast or not. This is not interested at that level. Yeah. Interestingly, it is analogous to Hindutva, which was almost to the year crafted 100 years ago by Veer Savarkar, who also said that, this is, he said it's different. I think it's broadly the same as Hinduism, but he basically said Hindutva is not interested in the ritual, theological aspects of different schools, okay, of different panths, yeah, of different sampradayas, or different schools of thought, yeah, of different, like whether it's Dvaita, Advaita, Vishishta Dvaita. Hindutva is basically the political recognition of the other. Yeah. Yes. Not because you want to create hatred, yes, but because you've already been deemed to be the other by somebody else. Exactly. And therefore that Purva Paksha, that, okay, I have been deemed to be an other. My natural instinct is never to see anybody else as the other. My natural impulse is in that theological sense, that the word itself, all these words are problematic in a translation sense, but my natural instinct in a theological sense, maybe not in a sociological sense, right, in a theological sense, it is universalistic. Yeah. Absolutely. Sociological sense is more to do with economics and, yeah, political structure. So Hindutva basically says you are a Hindu, yes, because, and the issue is he had to obviously make it relevant for those times. So therefore he said it, Punya Bhumi, yeah, but also Pitra Bhumi. Yes. Now, that is a very good enough approximate definition, and therefore very good enough in a revolutionary sense. Yeah. But what about Zoroastrians? Right. What about potentially somebody who's doing an African polytheistic puja, like a voodoo? Right. Funnily enough, we make fun of that in our everyday language. We don't even realize that. Yeah. What about a Native American worshipper? Yes. The idea behind Savarkar was that there are people, because the way monotheism is a closed corporation, proselytizing, that they have divided loyalties.
Yes.
It's a controversial thesis. Yes. It may be less applicable for one religion than the other based on its phase of evolution.
Right.
But the partition of India partially at least proved it right? Yes. Maybe not completely, partially proved it right. So in that sense, Hindutva was, let us understand that while we have all kinds of identities within that, of language, of caste in a jati sense, but not necessarily in a varna birth sense, of region, right, of gender and sex, of philosophy, of how we think in terms of Dvaita, of whether we are quote unquote atheist or not. That also is a very problematic translation in Hindi or Sanskrit. So he said, no, the overall rubric is Hindutva. So I think it's very important, because there is right now a very faint, it's very, very faint revival of pre-Abrahamic religions and gods and cultures across the world, but especially in the West, because they have actually had freedom of speech and secularism, broadly speaking, for, if not centuries, at least decades. And after the 1960s, the sexual revolution happened there. The Catholic Church was forced to become quote unquote relativistic, in the sense it said, okay, maybe outside of the church, there could be some salvation. There could be, the Jews may not actually burn in hellfire forever, partially because of the Holocaust guilt, partially because of changing culture. And there are many Catholic trads who oppose it internally, but they've not been successful at the papal level yet fully. Although the overall position is still very orthodox and not in any way dharmic. So my point is, there are neo-pagan revivals of pre-Christian religions in Germany, in Greece. In fact, a lot of American architecture historically, if you look at Abraham Lincoln's statue in DC, it's a copy of the Zeus statue, right, in parts of Greece. Like the Apollo space mission is named after a Greek god, Poseidon or Neptune. The days of the week, the months, the stars and planets. So much of it is, of course, because of Western and European domination and Eurocentrism. Nonetheless, they kept it not after Catholic or Catholic saints or Protestant figures. They kept it after Greco-Roman gods. And my point is, we don't have to say to those people that you must worship Ram, or you must even use the word Dharmatva.
Yes.
But it must be India's civilizational responsibility to, behind the scenes, in a very humble manner, yes, facilitate those resurgences. Ram Swarup wrote about this. I think indirectly Girilal Jain also kind of was hinting at it. And sometimes it will have to be done with a lot of humility. Sometimes, because ultimately these are matters of faith. You can't force it. You might make one temple with all different deities, but it can only be one temple. Yes. It has to be done locally. And I bring in the concept of the Panchayat and Puja from the Smarta kind of tradition. And the idea is, you have multiple gods, but you choose to prioritize one god. Right? In the Panchayat and Puja, historically, there are 5 gods, and your personal favorite, so to speak, your Ishta Devta could be at the center. The other ones could be in the 4 corners, maybe a Kul Devta, maybe a Gram Devta. And there are also historically some common accepted manifestations. There is one may be Shiva, one may be Shakti, there's a female form, there's some Vaishnav form. There is generally some worship of some animal, which is often represented by Ganeshji, and nature, Surya Devta. So it's a beautiful concept where all of nature is represented and all forms of humanity, forces of nature are represented. So why not think in terms of, as these Europeans or Africans or Native Americans or East Asians or Middle Easterns, remember, the satanic verses are about the daughters of Allah. Right. So there are female goddesses. Yes. There are 360 odd deities that were destroyed when Mecca was conquered. So there are these gods and goddesses. If somebody revives them, why not be a very silent, humble facilitator of that? It may take 50, 100 years. It may never fully happen. Yeah. But there is absolutely no downside to us, and every possible upside from an angle of peace, prosperity, and pluralism. Because what happened is, when some concepts of interest in these religions revived 100 years ago, their initial focus was on nationalism. Yes. Remember, in the narrow European nationalism sense, not in the Indian sense, as if I am in Lithuania and these are Lithuanian gods. which is fine. But what happened was they also tended to therefore exclude non-Lithuanians. And sometimes deliberately or otherwise, they became handmaidens to some kind of neo-fascist movement. And even when they were not, enemies of polytheism try to label them as handmaidens of fascism. Even today, Hitler is often linked to Hindutva in a very strange sort of manner. The most classical example being obviously the swastika, which has a completely different history. So, but my point is, okay, now we have a much more different multicultural West. You revive the Lithuanian religion, you worship multiple gods, and the central gods will remain Lithuanian, but maybe one of the gods can be Spanish. And that connection, that pantheons, interconnected pantheons, which obviously will also include some Indian/Hindu gods, I think will make it a very different world, because we already have, this is a very different way of approaching Eastern versus Abrahamic religions, right? We have holy festivals. Like I've been to music festivals in the UK, in places like Milton Keynes, which, if you were not aware, it looked like holy festivals. Of course, it was actually a music festival. So why not have that spirit of lightness, spirit of worship, seriousness as well as lightness, organically through research, whereby those, for example, all of Africa has been divided in roughly between a northern Islamic half and a southern Christian half. People don't know that sub-Saharan Southern Africa was basically Christianized within the last 100 years.
Right.
So why not bring back, in a very humble manner, the research, the theogony, how the gods descended? Why don't you document that? Isn't that what, in a way, our religion has done, right? With all our sacred texts, we have these ideas of the god. This god is the brother of that god and was married to that goddess, etc. So this is something very important, because people always consider their ancient past to be something deeply connected to them in an emotional manner.
Yes.
Even Egypt right now is trying to revive, obviously partially for tourist reasons. Partially it's a military dictatorship which is very afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it is trying to revive the Egyptian polytheist paganism. I don't like the word paganism in that sense. I like the word polytheism more, but it may work, it may not work. In fact, under Raza Pahlavi, the pre-Iranian Islamic revolution, they also tried to bring back the pre-Islamic past of Iran. It kind of washed away with the Islamic revolution, but it never fully goes away. The Shahnama is actually a documentation of pre-Islamic kings, ironically written by Ferdowsi and subsidized by Mahmud Ghazni, who actually did a lot of iconoclasm in India. But that memory of Shahnama was partially relevant in making Iran Shiite. Between the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, because that sense of national identity in a subterranean sense always remained. So, the world will never be fully homogenized.
Yes.
The only universalism that will work is a non-homogenizing universalism.
Yes.
And that kind of spirituality or religion, if you want to use that word, has to be cosmopolitan. So it is very important for India, as we get richer and more powerful, to A, remain humble, but B, try to help from the background to revive these movements at the government level, at a private sector level, at a non-profit level, at a research level, so that, because ultimately for us, it's not so important what god or goddess you're worshipping. The fact that we are part of that kind of polytheistic, pluralistic panchayatana framework is important, because we instinctually understand that I'm not trying to judge you for the god you're worshipping. Because that's not how a non-Abrahamic mind just thinks, whether it is shamanic or it's Buddhist or it's Vedic or it's Greco-Roman or it's, to some extent Zoroastrian. There are nuances, there are differences. So I think it's important that, when we say what is India's worldview, okay, if you become a Hindu Rashtra of sorts, which in a way we already are, okay, what next? What is the global vision? Parts of it have to be geopolitical and economic. But what is the spiritual? When you say you're a Vishwa Guru, I say, well, more important, first be a Vishwa Shishya, right? Because you first focus on what is it that, because, why did Cassius Clay become Muhammad Ali in the US in the 1950s or 60s or whenever he became? Because of self-respect. And because he saw that becoming Muslim in white Christian America, was his form of showing a middle finger to the discrimination all around him. It is unfortunate if India or dharmic or dharmatva kind of sensibilities were more prevalent, and if African native traditions were kind of more available on a plate for somebody who is clearly looking for that identity, then he or she might have gone directly for that. For him or for Malcolm X, who went for Nation of Islam, it wasn't for Islam per se, it was to oppose the white Christian dominance of America. So what could be more authentic than what their own ancestors worshipped? Even though the Reconstructionism may never happen in the same way, it might be slightly different. So whenever somebody says Black Lives Matter, I said, yes, absolutely, but Black faiths matter as well, because that is their souls. So I take that example because the Greco-Roman example is more well-known. The Native American example is known, but imagine Africa is going to have a huge population by the end of the century, even if some of the estimates are perhaps exaggerated. And what is our worldview about that? We don't want them to worship Ram or Krishna necessarily. Of course, if somebody does that through ISKCON or somebody else, that's fine. But if they are peaceful, prosperous, and worshiping their own gods and goddesses, and occasionally mixing and matching, because that's how gods have always spread, but organically, never in a forced manner, then it is completely in our civilizational interest, because that is how the Indian civilization becomes the universal human civilization, but never by homogenizing. So I hope you get a sense of where I'm trying to come from when I think of Dharmatva. So this is very much something that will happen over decades, because this is not something that will happen over the short term. But I think it is important to start thinking of what we want to achieve if and when we become more powerful and prosperous, as I think we will.
Absolutely, Harsh. And I think these are values and ideas which are at the very heart of our civilization. And it's only right for us to take up this responsibility. I think as India rises at the global stage, it has so much to contribute, like you said, for all of these movements where, the movements are happening from New Zealand to Africa to the American continents. There is so much that India and our civilization can contribute and sort of lead these efforts. Thanks for that. Harsh, before I conclude the conversation, I would want to request you to leave our viewers with some recommendations now. And I want to begin, I just pulled up your book, which is A New Idea of India by Harsh Madhusudan and Rajiv Mantri. It's a fantastic book, and a lot of ideas also we have discussed today from the book. But I want to also pick your brains and please share some books, articles, or other resources that you want to share for young Indians in particular, because there are a lot of our viewers who are just coming out of colleges, who are trying to make sense of the world. They're trying to make sense of the Indian economy, governance, civilization. So if you could share a few resources with them.
No, well, I mean, there are so many. Let's open my Kindle and see the books I've been reading of late.
Absolutely.
So let's divide it into like two parts: economic and civilization.
Yes.
Okay. So I think economic. It's very important to study economic history, right? Because I think ultimately history is the real test of theory. Unlike the sciences, although economics has a physics envy and pretends to be a science, there are no lab experiments in economics, right? It's ultimately what happened, and all counterfactuals are basically speculations beyond a point. So I would encourage people to read anything by Robert Allen, Bob Allen. He has a very short economic history. He has longer books. He has a very interesting take on why the British became rich, right? Including state capacity, including tariffs, but also the fact that they got lucky geographically and the wages were high and innovation happened. So I think anything by Bob Allen is very important. There is a very good book by Prasannan Parthasarthi called Why Europe Became Rich and Asia Did Not. So if you don't understand the great divergence, it's difficult for you to kind of wrap your head around the great convergence. Speaking of the great convergence, a very good book called, by that name itself, called The Great Convergence by Richard Baldwin. So he actually goes into the part about technologies and how, therefore, in the 21st century, as we go on decade by decade, it is more likely that the world will become more equal on a cross-country basis, not necessarily in an intra-country basis. Anything by Ray Dalio is very much worth reading, whether you agree or disagree about his views. For example, he made some strange comments about China recently, but Ray Dalio, one of the world's leading hedge fund managers, the latest book is The Changing World Order. I think on the civilizational side, I've been reading a lot about trying to understand this kind of who we are, this polytheist versus monotheist framework. There's a very good book called God Against the Gods by Jonathan Kirsch.
Okay.
Then I mentioned Jan Assmann, the Mosaic distinction. So if what we are seeing right now, very tragic incidents happening in the Harmandir Sahib. Yes. These are basically downstream effects. So whenever somebody says ideas are silly, well, they are silly in the short term, but in the long term, ideas are all that matter. So I think there is a book specifically on the evolution of the Sikh faith by Harjot Oberoi. I'm forgetting. It's a very expensive book. It's not available in India. So maybe somebody in North America can look into it. I think the Francis Fukuyama's Origins of Political Order is a very good book. I think Fukuyama is always getting a lot of flack because he said something 30 years ago that history has ended. And now all geopolitical books quote Fukuyama saying that, he was wrong, and he was wrong then, but his views have evolved dramatically a lot since then. I think that there are many books. I love reading about the evolution of technology as well. Let me just quickly look if there's one or two good books. I would highly recommend any book by Sanjeev Sanyal. Absolutely. I would highly recommend any book by Vikram Sampath. The last two books on Savarkar are very important, and the kind of opposition he faced in Ratnagiri when he was trying to reform Hindu society and trying to basically dilute caste. He faced a lot of opposition. I actually liked Ram Madhav's The Hindutva Paradigm because the RSS historically has not produced books and literature of its own. So I thought the book was very well researched. Maybe it could have been edited more tightly, but I really thought the book was lovely. And the final two books I would end by saying is one is The Invention of Religion in Japan. And I think it's an important book because in a way, because we live in a world dominated by Abrahamic religions, we have been forced to understand religion in a way that was not in consonance with their own civilizational ethos. Now, you can't go back completely, but what happened when the American steamboats went to Japan and they said, "What is your religion?" And they really had no translation for that. Just like religion does not translate to Dharma. Yes. And they were actually forced to come up with state Shinto in a way. Right. Earlier, Shinto and Buddhist were very, very much intertwined in Japan. In fact, even today in the census, if you ask them, the Shinto and Buddhist numbers add up to more than 100%. Right. Uniquely in global censuses. One last book I would mention is, this one is more technical, so let's go. Let's just I would say, well, let's go with another book on the non-economic side. This is a good book to finish with. It's called The Darkening Age. Yes. By Catherine Nixie, I think. Nixie. So she speaks about how basically kind of what we now call paganism collapsed in the Roman Empire and the long, dark medieval ages, and how basically Christianization of Europe was as coercive as various Islamic conversions in the other parts of the world later on, and how that has been whitewashed in history, which is very much like Edward Gibbon's the rise and fall, the fall and decline of the Roman Empire. So I would highly encourage watching The Darkening Age. There is a movie, if you don't want to read a book like that, called Agora, which is about fundamentalist Christians attacking this Greek place of learning in Alexandria, I think, which is Greek Egypt, which I thought was a very fascinating book. So it's very important because I always think in terms of religion in universalist terms. When I think of Sanatana Dharma, I think we are one version of that. Because if we are not one version, if we are all of it, then it cannot be Sanatan. It cannot be universal. It cannot be timeless. So I'm of late very fascinated by these other kind of what are known as primary religions by Jan Assmann, and then he called the Abrahamic religions to be secondary religions. Right. So I'll just let it be at that.
That's a fantastic list, Harsh. Thank you so much. I have made note of a lot of them, and they are going to be on my to read list, and I'm sure our viewers are going to do the same. Thank you so much, Harsh. It has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, very enriching, so many insights on a wide variety of topics. And I'm sure our viewers are taking away so much from this conversation. And thank you for also sharing that list at the end. And there's always so much you want to talk. There's so much to talk to you about. And we hope to have you again. Thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking to you. Please
Thank you so much, Harsh. And to our viewers, I would like to request you to let us know what you think about this conversation in the comment section. Do share this video. And if you're a new subscriber, if you're new on this channel, do subscribe to this channel. And we'll be back with another such fascinating conversation. Take care. Namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.